This may be a difficult concept for modern baseball fans to grasp, but up until the 1940s, 1950s, Philadelphia was mostly an American League city.
Really?
While the Phillies predated the Athletics, it was the Athletics who won 8 pennants and 5 world championships. The baseball stars of Philadelphia were Jimmy Fox, Al Simmons, Mickey Cochran, Lefty Grove, Chief Bender, Eddie Collins, Home Run Baker, Eddie Plank, Jack Combs. With few exceptions, your 20th century baseball stars from Philadelphia were from the A's. Now, those exceptions were somewhat notable. Chuck Klein, Gabby Cravath, Grover Cleveland Alexander, Cy Williams, Sherry McGee. But nonetheless, for the most part, Philadelphia was an American League city.
Really?
In fact, even after the A's left in 1954, there was still a loyal following for the team in the Delaware Valley. The Phillies would hold an annual exhibition game where they would bring back the old A's players and they would play the old Phillies players. The A's fans maintained a historical society that had a museum that was located in Willow Grove until about 2011. That historical society still exists, and their collection is still on display, although now it's on display at the Philadelphia Sports Hall of Fame, which is located on Grant Avenue in Northeast Philly. Even when the Phillies began their Wall of Fame back at Veterans Stadium, they inducted an athletics player every year alongside with a Phillies player. They did that until the Phillies left Veterans Stadium in 2003. In fact, all of those A's players who were inducted into the Philadelphia Wall of Fame, they're still listed on a plaque that's displayed on the statue of Connie Mack in the Citizens Bank Park parking lot. And all the while that the Athletics were having their success in Philadelphia in the early part of the 20th century, the Phillies were not only racking up last place finishes, but for multiple seasons they had over 100 losses, all from 1917 through the late 1940s. But by 1954, the two Philadelphia franchises had had dramatic reversals of fortune, resulting in one team leaving the city and the other team inheriting the legacy of Philadelphia's rich baseball tradition. And this is the story of how the Phillies fought off financial ruin and became the city's dominant baseball franchise. Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball History. Don't forget to check out our merchandise. T-shirts, phone cases, masks, notebooks, mugs, and much more. Just go to tpublic.com and look for Philadelphia Baseball History. Now, the fact of the matter is that during most of the first half of the 20th century, the Phillies were just horrible.
You don't say.
Sure, the Phillies had put a quality team together that won the National League pennant in 1915, and they finished in second place in 1916. But a lopsided financial arrangement, which was a leftover of the Horace Vogel era, that locked the Phillies into a 99-year lease of the Baker Bowl. And while the stadium was state-of-the-art when it was built, it was the first brick and steel structure that was made for baseball. It was the first stadium that utilized a cantilever design for the upper decks when it was constructed back in 1895. But by 1910, the stadium had become outdated. For one thing, its capacity lagged behind Shibe Park, which was the Athletics' new home that had been constructed and opened in 1909. Another problem was the dimensions. This park was built to fit into a city block, and a very odd city block dimension as well, because there was a train yard across the street, across Broad Street. So you had this minuscule right field porch, this really small area in right field where the wall was a mere 280 feet down the line from home plate to the foul pole. And when baseball started replacing the balls, when they started using a ball that had a cork center, and then in 1919 when they refined the ball further because of the accident that had taken the life of a ball player who was hit in the head, and they started replacing baseballs more often and making sure that there was a clean white ball, well, it was pretty clear that the Baker ball was no longer appropriate to play Major League Baseball. And that's because not just the Phillies, certainly the Phillies took advantage of that short right field porch. Gabby Cravath was notorious for hitting lots of home runs over the right field fence. The fact that there was a short right field porch is what delayed Chuck Klein from being inducted into the Hall of Fame until 1980. Other Phillies stars, such as Cy Williams and Sherry McGee, are all tainted with the fact that they played all of their home games in the Baker Bowl, where they had that short right field area. Even if they did have that 60-foot fence, a fly ball to right field was a home run. That also meant that there were a lot of games that were played in Baker Bowl that were just high scoring. I mean, the Phillies may have had a lot of good hitting during the time, but they had lousy pitching, all because of the dimensions of the ballpark. But most importantly, the field's owners, and after 1903, the Phillies were not the owners of the Baker Bowl anymore. Instead, ownership was split, and eventually ownership was passed to the same group that owned the Chicago Cubs. And that ownership group, the group that owned the Baker Bowl, well, they failed to invest in the park's upkeep, so the park had become dilapidated.
I'm only 93 and a half years old.
In fact, the park had deteriorated so much that by the 1920s and the 1930s, spectators who came to see the Phillies, well, they were very much in danger of having their clothes ruined and covered from falling rust, from the steel structures that had, deteriorated over the years.
And this house is falling apart.
In addition, there was no public announcement system. Players were announced by a public announcer who was behind home plate with a bullhorn. There were never any plans to install any lighting, so there would never be any night games at the Baker Bowl. Now, once William Baker became the team president in 1913, he did attempt to reach a deal with Ben Scheib in order to allow the Phillies to lease Scheib Park for their home games. But he and Ben Scheib never really came to an agreement. The sticking point was on concessions. The Phillies, of course, wanted to control concession sales when they were home, and Benjamin Scheib said, no, the A's, we are always going to control the concession sales. And because they never reached an agreement, that meant the Phillies had to continue playing in this dilapidated and deteriorating ballpark. Interestingly, it was Baker's tight-fisted nature which prompted many Philadelphians to begin calling the ballpark. The ballpark was actually officially named National League Park, not the Baker Bowl, but they began calling it the Baker Bowl after the president, William Baker. It was more of a derisive nickname. And indeed, William Baker's stinginess did have a big part to play in the team's demise. For example, Baker didn't want to pay Grover Cleveland Alexander his worth. He also believed that when the United States entered the First World War, that sooner or later Alexander was going to be drafted into the Army. So once the war broke out, Baker traded Alexander to the Cubs, and that was after the 1917 season. And the 1917 season can be the point in time that we can pinpoint when the Phillies started to really deteriorate and be a bad baseball team. It was from that point on until the 1940s that the Phillies lingered in the second division for all but 1 year, and mostly finishing in either last place or next to last place.
Why, I could lick them in a ball game with one hand tied behind my back.
In fact, even the influx of sluggers, people who were prolific home run hitters such as Cy Williams or Chuck Klein, that did very little to help the Phillies' prospects. William Baker died in 1930, and he was succeeded as Phillies president by Gerald Nugent. Now, to Nugent's credit, he attempted to improve the team, but he was hamstrung by the bad finances that he inherited. The ballpark that was falling apart, and Nugent was unable to attract the fans that come to the games in order to earn the money to pay for the quality players. In fact, the situation got so bad that by 1942, the Phillies couldn't afford to send the team to spring training, let alone field the team for an entire season. Reluctantly, Nugent was forced to go to the National League in order to seek some financial assistance. And again, reluctantly, the league helped out. I mean, it wouldn't have done any good to have a team from a major city just drop out and have an odd number of teams for the season. So the National League essentially helped out the Phillies to make sure that they could go to spring training and start the season. During the 1942 season, Nugent actively tried to sell the Phillies, and eventually the league stepped in and they took the team off his hands. The league, the National League, bought the Phillies. Now, there have been rumors that the baseball commissioner at the time, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, that he pressured the National League president, Ford Frick, to buy the Phillies from Nugent in order to avoid a situation where the owner of a minor league club, the Milwaukee Brewers, a man by the name of Bill Veeck, would buy the team. You see, Beck claims in his autobiography that he had a deal in the works, and in that deal, he would have bought the Phillies from Nugent and then staffed the team with stars from the Negro Leagues, and that would have been for the 1943 season. Veeck claims that as a courtesy, he tipped off Landis to what his strategy was, and that Landis worked behind the scenes, being that he was an unabashed segregationist, in order to put the kibosh on the deal. There are some stories, there are some newspaper stories from the 1940s and the 1950s from some witnesses that Veeck spoke with that may support Veeck's recounting of this incident, an incident that he put in his 1962 autobiography. What remains true is the main source of all this information is Bill Veeck himself. And a lot of people agree that Bill Veeck was prone to, shall we say, a degree of exaggeration. So his story's not proven. I'm not going to say it's not true because you can't really prove a negative. And there are some contemporary accounts that seem to back up that Veeck talked about this plan. But if it went as far as Beck claims in his 1962 autobiography, that's a question that still remains in doubt and that I believe is still subject to some skepticism.
You sound skeptical.
I don't know.
The whole point of whether or not Veeck had actually arranged to bring Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson to Philadelphia in 1943, which is essentially what he claims, that's questionable.
I don't believe you.
What is true is that 1943 was the nadir in Phillies history. The Second World War had robbed the major leagues of most of their talent. There were superstars such as Stan Musial, Ted Williams, and Bob Feller, who all served in the military during this time. And the quality of play, even though Major League Baseball continued at President Roosevelt's insistence, the quality of play had suffered. One of the cities that really felt this drain on talent during the 1940s was the Philadelphia Phillies. The Phillies, for one thing, the drain of talent wound up extending the career of players such as Chuck Klein and even Jimmy Foxx. Now, they were a shadow of the players that they were back in the 1930s. In fact, Jimmy Foxx, he was no longer the power hitter or slugger that he's famous for being. Instead, by 1943, Jimmy Foxx finished his career pitching for the Phillies. So before the 1943 season, we had an interesting situation where the National League sold the Phillies, which was now in their possession. They sold it to William Cox. And Cox had hired Bucky Harris to act as the manager of the Phillies. Now, Bucky Harris, he wasn't very fond of the way that Cox was so hand-on in the way he approached the Phillies team. Harris objected to things like Cox being ever present in the Phillies' practices. Well, this was Cox's team, and as a result, Cox fired Harris during a press conference on July 27, 1943. Cox had not informed Harris that he was going to do this.
You're fired.
And so Harris, understandably, was a little annoyed with this. So in retaliation, Harris revealed that Cox had been betting on Phillies games.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much.
Now, in Cox's defense, he was actually betting on the Phillies. It was an act of confidence in his team, although it was, shall we say, foolhardy. Nonetheless, Cox broke the most sacred and sacrosanct rule in baseball: you don't gamble. So Landis banned Cox for life from baseball, and he forced him to sell the Phillies. And this, 1943, when William Cox sold the Phillies, is when their fortunes changed. Cox sold the Phillies to the heir of the DuPont fortune, Robert Carpenter, and Robert Carpenter appointed his son, Bob Carpenter Jr., to be the president of the Phillies. And Bob Carpenter, when he took over the team, he made the time, he took the effort, he invested the resources to develop the talent for the Phillies to become winners. He developed the Phillies farm system. He invested in developing the players in the minor leagues. And this is where the Phillies and the Athletics had their huge departure in their fortunes. You see, Connie Mack, he had built 2 championship dynasties by using his network of friends and contacts in baseball in order to give him a sort of inside track on the prospects across the country who showed some talent. This is, for example, how he recruited Jimmie Foxx. It just so happens that one of Connie Mack's old players, Frank Home Run Baker, was the manager of a team on the Eastern Shore League in Maryland, and he was managing Jimmie Foxx when Jimmie Foxx was a teenager. He let Connie Mack know about him, and Connie Mack had the inside track in obtaining Jimmie Foxx's services for his team. Now, in the late 1920s, you had Branch Rickey, who was the general manager of the St. Louis Cardinals, who began developing this new trend of the Major League Ball Club actually owning and controlling the minor league affiliates. Before that, minor leagues were all very independent, and they did not have a one-on-one relationship with a major league team. Branch Rickey started to change all that, and Connie Mack disparaged the system. He called it chain store baseball, and this resulted in the A's never really developing their farm system and being able to develop their own talent in the minor leagues. The end result is that when Connie Mack sold off the stars from the 1929 to 1931 championship team, the A's were never really able to field another talented team since that, which meant that for a good 20 years, the A's were just as bad, if not worse, than the Phillies. Now, in the meantime, Bob Carpenter was building up the Phillies' prospects. By the end of the 1940s, the Phillies had produced such players as Granny Hamner, Pudd'nhead Jones, and Del Ennis. And to that roster, they would add homegrown pitchers like Curt Simmons and Robin Roberts, and then they would add Richie Ashburn. So this system, it produced 2 Hall of Famers, Robin Roberts and Richie Ashburn. And this core of young, homegrown talent that Carpenter had developed, they were affectionately known as the Whiz Kids.
The Whiz Kids had won it.
The Whiz Kids. They were the team that shocked the baseball world by winning the National League pennant in 1950. And yes, we know that the Whiz Kids were swept by the Yankees in the World Series. The thing is that each one of those 4 games, even though the Phillies did lose, each one of those 4 games was a close contest. So even though they were swept, it's not like the Yankees just steamrolled over them. The Phillies were in each of those 4 games. And it's because of all this that the 1954 announcement that the A's were leaving Philadelphia sent shockwaves through the city. In fact, for a while, a good many Philadelphia baseball fans just joked that the wrong team left Philadelphia. But the fact is that by 1950, there really had been a big shift in baseball culture in Philadelphia. The A's were mired in the past, and they had little hope of turning around their prospects. Meanwhile, the Phillies, who had endured decades and decades of really bad baseball, they had turned their franchise around. Don't get me wrong, it's true that at times the Phillies have fallen back into the basement. And yes, it wouldn't be another 30 years until that team finally won its first world championship.
Take this world championship and savor it, because you all deserve it.
But they did win a world championship. In fact, they won two. That was something that would have been unheard of in the 1930s and 1940s. But the 1940s remains this sort of renaissance for the Phillies, a time when the team showed that it was willing to join the modern era of recruitment and player development, something that the Athletics failed to do. Which is why, at a critical point in Philadelphia baseball history, one team failed and left the city, while the other team turned around their franchise and became the heir to Philadelphia's baseball tradition. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you have any ideas for topics that we can cover in the future, please let us know in the comments below. If you would like to see more of these videos, please consider becoming a patron through Patreon. Again, we'll have a link in the description box below.